Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Plaza Theater. I'm Kevin Allen from the Calgary Gay History Project, and I'm your MC for this event. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot people in the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and that includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. The Calgary Gay History Project is a research collective whose focus is to save and preserve our stories, LGBTQ2 stories. And I've been immersed in gay history since we started the project in 2012, and recently wrote the book Our Past Matters. AIDS in Calgary hit the city in 1983. That was when we had our first AIDS-related death. And then the death rate went up exponentially, like it did in many places in North America. Calgary was one of the hardest hit cities in Canada. But it also started the formation of our early pride organizations and human rights activist organizations. In honor of this year's Calgary Pride Festival, Twisted Element has partnered with HIV Community Link to bring two incredible guest speakers to Calgary, Cleve Jones and Ruth Burks. Thank you. And now I'm honored to invite our first speaker on the stage, recognized for her activism and support of AIDS victims during the peak of the crisis in the 80s. She was often the only caregiver for victims and buried many herself in her family's private cemetery in Arkansas. Welcome, Ruth Burks.
Hello, Calgary. Thank you so much for inviting me up here today. It's a great honor. And with Cleve, he's a hero, not me. And it's such an honor. And it affected your community. What happened is back in 1984, I was 25 years old. And I was just, a straight church lady. I had a little 2-year-old daughter, and so I was divorced, and I wanted to teach her to go out and do what Christ had taught us to do, to feed the sick, to feed the poor, to, take care of the hungry, just to do it. And, we would go after church, and I had a friend who was in the hospital in Little Rock, and she had had her tongue removed from cancer. So, I was hanging around over there. I was her interpreter. And I noticed that there was a door down the hallways that had a bag, a red bag, the color of this dress, and no one was going in it. And his food tray, I'd never seen styrofoam food trays, so they were lining up down the hall like they were going to feed a dog. And the nurses, we were all friends because this was Bonnie's 5th reconstructive surgery. I would bake cookies and they would eat them out of, the container, and, I could use their phone and their pens, and it was like a second home. So one day I noticed the nurses out in the hall drawing straws to see who would go in and check on this person. And they would draw the straws and they go, oh, I got the short one. Let's do best 3 out of 5. Let's, 9 out of 10, anything. And then they would just completely ignore it like it never happened. And they had done something. They'd go on down the hall and do something else. And this went on and on. And I had heard about AIDS. My cousin in Hawaii, who was gay, I was worried about him. So when I was over there, I said, I'm really worried about you. And he says, with this new disease. And he goes, oh, no, honey, that's just the leather guys in San Francisco. And so here I am trying to figure out what a leather guy is, but, obviously my cousin wasn't, and so he didn't get it. But when I came back, it still just nagged at me and nagged at me and nagged at me. And so I always kept up with it. And, you get like this much coverage in the United States, like Time Magazine. When was, like 1987, was that the first year they did a story? It was very later than I wanted. Yeah, and so I just lost I'm sorry, I've had a stroke, so I'm like off on a squirrel. So anyway, I came back and I went in that room And I don't know why I went in that room. I feel like that God asked me or told me or gave me a choice to go in that room or not. But I did, and I walked in. And the young man was so skeletal and so frail that you really couldn't tell him from the bed sheets in the room. And I walked up to the bed and I took his hand and, I was rubbing his arm and I knew that it was that gay disease, and that's all anybody, it wasn't even called GRID yet. And so I, asked him if there was anything I could do for him, and I just couldn't imagine why somebody wasn't going in there. And he said he wanted his mother. And I thought, well, I can do that. That's easy to do, and then my obligation will be over, and I did what I needed to do, and, I did my good deed. So I went to the nurse's station and just said, can we call his mother? He's asking for her. And they're like, you didn't go in that room, did you? And I go, well, yeah. And they go, oh, you shouldn't have gone in that room. And they said, nobody's coming to see him. Nobody's been to see him in 3 weeks, and nobody's coming now. So they backed away. And I couldn't even use the ink pen. So I asked for his mother's number because they weren't going to give it to me. And they were very hurt and rude and they hated me at that point. And how it can change, I've never understood, but it did. And she had a really pretty cross on too, nice diamonds. But, so, I thought she was my friend. But anyway, so I started to pick up their phone and I couldn't use their phone. So I thought, all right, and I just kept saying the number over and over in my head until I got to the payphone down the hall. And I called her and she promptly hung up on me. So I knew I had the right number. And this was before caller ID. So I called her back and she answered. And I said, if you hang up on me, I will put your son's obituary in the hometown newspaper and I'll list his cause of death. I had a complete attention. So I told her, what was going on, that he was near death and he wanted to see her. And she said, my son died years ago, and I don't know what that thing is you have up there, but it's not mine. And hung up on me. Oh, she said, don't call back, even when it dies. And so, I went, it knocked the wind out of me. So I went back in. I thought, what am I going to tell this young man who only wants to see his mother before he dies? And I walked in and I took his hand and I was rubbing his arm and he looked up at me and he said, oh, Mama, I knew you'd come. And so I didn't know what to say. And I told him, I said, I'll be right back, honey. I'll be right back. And I ran down to Bonnie's room and I said, I've got this situation and he thinks I'm his mother and I don't know what to tell him or what to do. And she said, I don't need your help right now. He does. So I went back and I stayed with him for 13 hours until he drew his last breath. And I talked to him and I sang songs to him and I straightened his bed and I took a washcloth and kept his face clean and kept him comfortable. And so when he died and I walked out of that room and I saw the nurses and they go, well, now what are you going to do with his body? And I thought, wait a minute. I just said we needed his mother. I didn't say I was taking him home, but I realized nobody else. I thought the hospital had a morgue and they would take him and, do whatever they needed to do, but they weren't having any part of it. So there was a town that I called that I knew that I couldn't get any help in the big city. So I had to call a town that had like little small funeral home, and I knew they were in financial trouble. You could just tell the grass wasn't mowed and things like that. And they agreed to come and pick him up, but they said, we have to cremate him. And I said, that's fine. So then I was at home with my daughter one Saturday, and here comes a box in the mail from the postman. I thought, wow, who's sending me a present? And the address, it didn't really have a good address on it, so I didn't know what it was, and I opened it up, and to my surprise, it was a plastic bag with Jimmy's ashes in it. And what was I going to do? So I couldn't bury him in that. I couldn't bury him in a plastic bag in a cardboard box. So I fixed my daughter up really cute with a big bow in her hair, because that's what you do in the South. And we went to a pottery place, and I thought, well, maybe they would have a piece of pottery that was chipped, or maybe it didn't fire right and the color's off a little bit, that maybe they'll give it to me. And so it ended up being a chipped cookie jar. It had a little nick in it. And I took it home, and I had Jimmy's ashes in a box, in the same box under my arm, in case I had to whip them out and, you know, really put some pressure on him to let me have that. You gotta do what you gotta do, okay? And I was pretty new at this. So anyway, I went to the town cemetery, and they said, no, what did he die from? He's not related to you, because everybody knows everybody. And I said, well, he's a friend from Little Rock and all that. He said, he didn't die from that gay disease, did he? And I said, well, I don't know what he died from. He said, well, if he died from that gay disease, I don't want any of them gay juices running from the cemetery down into those caskets. And I said, honestly, you're telling me that like you believe it? And you expect me to believe it? You know, my roots aren't blonde. And so anyway, no. And back in 1970, my mother and her oldest brother got into quite the tussle, I guess is the best way of saying it. And so, you know, cemeteries were very important to my family, and they are to most people. And so we have a cemetery where my family had been burying people since 1826, when my family arrived in Hot Springs. And my mother went to that cemetery. There was a woman that was kind of in charge of the cemetery, and I was 10 years old. She drugged me along, and she bought 262 grave spaces, so her brother and his family couldn't be buried with the rest of us. And every Sunday we would go out, and she'd say, someday all of this is going to be yours. And I'm an only child. And she said, don't you ever let your uncle be buried here? So I'm like, you know, okay, I'm 10 years old, but I get it. And she even put up her own marker, and it said, woe be unto ye hypocrites, Pharisees, and scribes. So I learned very early on what cemeteries mean and what they do. And so I took Jimmy, and I took a pickaxe, and I took post hole diggers, and my daughter, and she had a little bucket and a little shovel, and we dug the grave for Jimmy. And I buried him on top of my daddy because I didn't want to lose him, and I didn't want somebody to come and dig him up, because I was afraid if anybody found out that I had buried what was, you know, soon to be known as AIDS, that they would, you know, destroy the cemetery. And so we had a little do-it-yourself funeral, and that was it. That was it. And I did this undercover for a long time, because there wasn't a judge alive that wouldn't have taken my daughter away from me. And in a hot minute, she'd have been gone. So we would go out, and we'd get pickup truck load of Christmas tree and Christmas cards and decorations and everything, and we would take it to a house where there were 4 men who were living in it, trying to take care of each other so that they would have a great last Christmas. And we did all of these things. So when my ex-husband died in an automobile accident, then I came out of the closet, so to speak, that I was taking care of AIDS patients, and y'all come. And the hospital had already started giving out my number, and it's like, here's this crazy woman in Hot Springs who's not afraid of you, go to her. And so they kept coming and coming, and I got all the drag queens, which I thought was just amazing because I'd never seen a drag queen before. I was straight church going, I was raised Southern Baptist, but I decided to raise my daughter Methodist because I didn't think they had enough religion to offend anyone. But since then, they have this past year shown, yes, they have a lot of religion to offend a lot of people. So maybe that will rectify itself. But they kept coming and coming, and I buried over 40 in my family cemetery because their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters did not want their bodies to even claim them to bury them. And the thing about the central part of the United States is you hear about AIDS on the West Coast and you hear about it on the East Coast, but nobody knows where some of these people really come from. They come from the little small towns where they left because they were thrown out of their homes. Their families would have been thrown out of their churches if, they even knew they had a gay child. And for a long time during this, I wondered if it was the gay they were more afraid of or the AIDS. And sometimes I didn't know. And so I had, Billy was my favorite. And, you always have a favorite no matter what. And since I'm in Canada, I can say he was my favorite. But I remember one night I took him to the emergency room at about 2 o'clock in the morning because nothing ever happens between 8 and 4 in the afternoon. And the hospital refused to let him in the emergency room. And they called the police. And we're standing in the parking lot in freezing winter, and here he is so frail and so sick, and they call a police car to come and get him and take him to jail because they were not equipped, they told me, to take an AIDS patient. Well, the police are standing going, we're not equipped either, and he's not getting in my car. So I went and called the administrator at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I told him that he was getting ready to get more free publicity than he could ever imagine. And I said, if you don't admit him, I will have every television satellite truck here at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you will get the news all week long, and you can be out there telling the public why you won't take a sick young man. And I am ashamed of you. And you had better get your act straight because this isn't the only one you're going to have. So after that, and at my church, they wanted to throw me out. I was on the finance committee. I was so proud. I was the first woman on the finance committee, and I was an active member of the church, and I really loved it. And so I asked the minister if I could have one room in the breezeway, not inside the building, to have a support group meeting. And he said, surely you're not talking about bringing those people into this church. And I said, oh, no, Dr. Hayes, I'm not talking about bringing those people into this church. I'm talking about walking those people across the new $30,000 lawn we just bought you, walking them into your new $300,000 house the church just bought you, and sitting their asses on your $60,000 worth of furniture we just bought you. That's what I'm going to do with those people. He never let me have a room, but he did come up he had already left and retired, but he came up at a church social and wanted to apologize to me. I said, I'm not the one you need to apologize to, and I don't have the authority to accept your apology. I said, you know who you need to apologize to. And at that point, he was just an old man trying to get into heaven. And he wasn't getting in with any help from me. But, that's what we had to deal with. And these young men who wanted to go to San Francisco or went to Los Angeles. They were free to live their lives the way they wanted to and love who they wanted to and hold hands or whatever they wanted to do, and they could do it, or go to New York and in the theater and just everything. And we lost so many talented, beautiful, wonderful people. And then they had to come home. They had to come home, and there was no medicine for them. Doctors didn't want them. The hospitals obviously weren't equipped to take them. I've been told that. There was nothing. There wasn't a doctor that would see them, nothing. And I would have to ask them, okay, let me ask you this. Where did you come from? Okay, can you get 3 months supply of medicine and have somebody ship it to you or whatever? I don't care, because I've got to find somebody that will take care of you. And I ended up running an underground pharmacy. I mean, it was packed. I have a friend that ran the gay bar, and we were talking about it the other day. He said, yeah, you said you had a pharmacy, but oh my God, when I opened that door. But, you know, if somebody couldn't take their ACT or their DDI or all the letters, then why throw it away? Because I would have to go to somebody and say, can I borrow 5 of your AZT? And then, you know, how long does he have to live? 3 days. You think, okay, well, let's see. I have somebody that needs some, and I'll, you know, and so you give it back, and you switch it around, and ended up that the pharmacy board of the state said, you know what, that's fine, just no class narcotics, which was fine with me. But there were just absolutely, and Hot Springs being a tourist town, we had 6.5 million visitors a year. And, you know, you can have a husband and a wife or whatever, but when you come to Hot Springs for a convention, game on. And I also felt that it was my obligation, because Hot Springs is so, you know, I know a lot of people that love Hot Springs as much as I do, but I don't know of anyone who loves her anymore. And, you know, my family had been there 100 years or more, 1826, I can't do the math. And, you know, I felt like it was my obligation to make sure that everybody knew. There was always a big bowl of condoms at the bar, and you just take a handful and go, and it was just outreach, but the community hated me. Oh, they hated me. And here I was making a mockery of Hot Springs, and that disease was never going to happen here. And if it does, we'll run them out of town. But, you know, we won. And I learned so much from my guys my guys lived 2.5 years past the national average. Most of the guys would show up at the hospital and they would almost be dead. I mean, 6 weeks was the usual time, and from the time they got to the hospital until they died. And they came down to see the Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health, and everybody, well, what's happening down there? Why are her patients living? And, well, how do you know they are? Well, it says right here. So they came down and just went around with me for a week. They came with the CDC for a few days, at the NIH. They stopped in to see me, and then they went to Los Angeles. I think the Los Angeles AIDS Project is where they went. And the Journal of American Medical Association in 2014, after an article came out about me, they said, you know, all the technology we have and all of everything, who would have thought that love and a human touch was all it would take for somebody to live longer? So my guys knew that they were loved. They knew that I loved them as much as my own child. And I would tell them about my daddy, and, you know, he's got a great spot in the front of the cemetery so y'all can watch the cars pass, and he'll take care of you, and he'll keep you safe, and he will love you. And my grandparents are over here, and I kind of give them a tour of the cemetery. And sometimes when my guys were sick, and I would be reading to them at home or something, because they had cytomegalovirus retinitis and they were going blind. And I have my daddy's from Florida, and they homesteaded Key Largo back in the 1800s, if you can imagine that. And I had a tour book of Key West that I had picked up when I was, gosh, a teenager. And it was all dog-eared, and I would take them on a tour, and they thought it was wall-to-wall, gorgeous, naked men all the way down there, and they could just see it in their mind. And, you know, they would take their AZT the day they died because they knew that the next day, tomorrow, they're coming out with a cure. And they were going to Key West. That was the first thing they were going to do, and they were going to sample everything they could and report back to me how Key West was. But, you know, it was such a, I never thought that I would be ostracized and you know, they tried to run me out of town and all of that. And yeah, a lot of the times I had these women from the church, and my church was where all the doctors and bankers went, but that's where I ended up finding my help, and I knew that, so that's why I stayed. And you know, it's just hard to believe that we treated people that way, human beings, fellow human beings. And it's going backwards in the United States. It's terrible. It's awful. And I know that, you know, everybody's frightened. No one knows what's going to happen, but they know it's not good. So our battle is just now starting all over again. And it's going to be a fierce battle. And in the States, you can't do any AIDS education at all. All you can do is abstinence only. And you and I know there's probably a lot of people maybe sitting in this auditorium that are here because of abstinence only. Because it doesn't work. And that's all we can teach. If you get any government money at all, you cannot, and our vice president said, oh, condoms are too new. We don't know anything about condoms. They're way too new. So we're in for a battle, and I hope it doesn't cross the line and come up here. I hope that, you all keep up the good work. I mean, the amazing work that y'all have done. And don't ever sit and think, well, I've done it, and that was my good deed, and I've done it, because, whenever you ask, or whenever I've ever asked God, what next? I feel like he's got a little Rolodex beside his chair or his throne. He goes, well, we haven't tried the plague since the 1500s. Let's see how she likes that. So I know not to ever ask that, but you just have to keep your eyes open, keep your cell phone in your purse or in your pocket, and you just have to keep an eye out. And, do good when you can. And be kind when you can. And be loving. And, hopefully this isn't, there's got to be a turning point. And we don't know when that's going to be, but we're hopeful for it. And, yeah. But I just wanted to thank you all for having me up here, and it's such an honor. It's such an honor to be up here with Cleve. I'm fangirling him right now.
He and his boyfriend, Scott Smith, had opened a little camera store on Castro Street. Castro Street had begun its transformation from a kind of sleepy Irish and Scandinavian neighborhood into, gay Mecca. And a big part of it was Harvey's camera store. It was I don't think he ever made any money on it, but it was a place where young people like myself could go and get involved in politics. And so I thought, well, I want to be a film director. And San Francisco City College had a really great film program. And I went and I enrolled in that. And those of you who are older will remember the advent of the Super 8 cameras. This was the first time ordinary people could afford to buy a small motion picture camera. So I saved my money and I bought me a camera, and I made my first film. And Scott and Harvey and a few others had decided they were going to have a film festival in the back of the camera store, a sheet on the back wall, And so I showed Harvey this little Super 8 film I'd made, and, well, he just said, "Girl, you have no talent at all. You need to change your major." And I was just, heartbroken. But he said, if you'll change to political science and go to San Francisco State, when I get elected, you can come and work with me at City Hall. And I said, "Harvey, you've lost 3 elections in a row." He said, "No, this time I'm going to do it." And I believed him, and I changed my major. And I had the extraordinary privilege of working in his office for 11 months. We worked on everything from the first gay rights ordinance to getting stop signs put in at dangerous intersections, securing funding for Latino mental health programs in the Mission District. It was a really great gig for a kid who was beginning to think, maybe I want to be an activist, maybe I want to be one of these kinds of people. And Harvey was, he's been so mythologized now, and played by Sean Penn, and on a postage stamp, and I can't believe the Navy named a ship after him. I don't think he would really like that. But it's an oiler, so I don't really know what that means. What I would like you to know about Harvey is that Harvey Milk was an ordinary person. Harvey Milk was not a genius. He was not a saint. His life was in disarray much of the time. He'd reinvented himself so many times. Looking back at his history and reading the new biography, it's really quite astonishing. His life was full of turmoil. He had more than 2 partners who committed suicide. He was broke. He experienced all of the challenges and defeats and humiliations that all of us endure in our lifetime. But he was honest. He loved his people. And when he found his calling, he went with it, And this is a story that I think many of us in this room already know, and in our larger community we know very well, where people suddenly realized what they were actually supposed to do. And I got to work with him, and it was extraordinary. And then on November 27th, 1978, I went to work early because it was the Thanksgiving holiday coming up, and his 2 paid staffers were going to be on visiting their families, and I wanted to show up early and show him how useful I could be. And I got there, and first thing he tells me is that he needed a file that I'd left in my apartment back in Castro Street, and he was annoyed with me. And I was just so crestfallen, and I said, "Well, I'll go get it." He said, "Yeah, you'll go get that file and bring it back right now." And then he could see that he'd been harsh, and he said, "I'm sorry, it's just there's so much politics going on here, and you go get the file and get some lunch. And by the way, the workers are picketing at the Patio Cafe, so say hi to them for me, and we'll see you this afternoon." So I went back to Castro, and I got the file, and walked down the street to the Patio Cafe where the workers were, and I was holding a picket line, and the 24 Divisadero bus pulled up, and a woman yelled at me out the window, "Cleve, they shot the mayor." And I couldn't imagine who would want to shoot Mayor Moscone. He was just the most charismatic guy. He and Harvey sort of invented the progressive coalition that brought trade unionists and environmentalists and feminists and the people we now call LGBTQ. And I got in a taxi and got to City Hall as fast as I could. I went through the western entrance to the building, and I don't know how many of you have been in San Francisco City Hall. It's a very beautiful building, and with a grand staircase, and Harvey had always said, "Don't take the elevator, you go up that staircase." And I ran up the staircase, and the opposite side of the building from the mayor's office, and I saw all the police over by the mayor, and I went to the Board of Supervisors, and I had a key to the private chambers, and I let myself in, and I remember running down the hallway yelling, "Harvey, Harvey, where are you?" and then turning the corner and seeing his feet. And I knew it was Harvey because he only had 1 pair of dress shoes, a pair of secondhand wingtips. And I remember coming around the corner and looking down, and I'd never seen a dead person before. I'd never seen close up what bullets do. And all I remember thinking is, it's over. It's just over. He was my mentor. I was still not speaking to my own father, so he'd become kind of my dad. He was our leader, and he was going to get me a job, and he believed in me, and he was my leader, and all I could think was, it's over, and we're sitting in his little cubicle office playing the audio tape that he recorded because he anticipated being assassinated, and I used to tease him and say, you're not important enough to get shot. And it was so eerie to listen to that recording while his body's right there, and all I can think is, it's over, it's just over. And then I went back to Castro Street, and the sun went down, and people began to gather on Castro, and gay and straight and young and old and black and brown and white and immigrant and native born, and we lit our candles, and we began that march, 50,000 strong, in absolute silence, from Castro Street down Market Street to City Hall. And I remember standing in that lake of candlelight, surrounded by all these total strangers who were all grieving for Harvey as deeply as I was, and I knew I was wrong. It wasn't over. It was really just beginning. And I'm still, all these years later, haunted by what I saw, and also amazed by just what that did to me. That fixed my course. And there were many twists and turns along the way, but I think I understood clearly from that moment on that there was something I was supposed to do to the best of my ability. With all my flaws, I was going to do what I could to make sure that Harvey Milk and George Moscone were remembered. And that became kind of my mission. The murderer, the appropriately named Dan White, was a former police officer, a disgruntled former colleague of Harvey's on the Board of Supervisors. And he went on trial, and somehow in San Francisco they managed to come up with a jury that was all white and all heterosexual. Now that's quite an achievement in San Francisco in the late 1970s. Really? All white straight people? How did you do that? And people began to get nervous. They thought, he could get off. But I'd been there and saw it, and I said, you're crazy, he's not going to get off. But he got off, was convicted of manslaughter. He smuggled guns into City Hall, went to one end of the building, put 5 bullets in the mayor, reloaded, walked all the way to the other end of the building, and blew away Harvey, and then they convinced a jury that he'd been eating too many sugary snacks, Twinkies and Coca-Colas, and that it made him go crazy. Well, we marched again that night when the verdict came out. That was May 21st, 1979, but we weren't carrying candles, we were carrying torches. And about 50,000 of us ran all the way from Castro Street to City Hall and burned every police car we could find. And that was called the White Night Riots. I don't know if there's any young people here, I can't really see you, but I'm not offering this part as career guidance. But I was accused of inciting a riot and was blamed on the front page of both of our daily newspapers. And the result of that was that I was hired by the Speaker of the California Assembly to go and work in Sacramento, our capital, as a legislative assistant. So, again, not career guidance, but... so I go off to Sacramento, and I didn't really know what I was going to be doing there, but they assigned me to the Assembly Health Committee. So my job was to look at all of the bills that were coming before the State Assembly related to health, and then work with the Democratic members of the Health Committee to let them know what the Democratic leadership position was on a whole range of issues, from asbestosis to Alzheimer's disease, anything you could think of under the big envelope of public health issues. I didn't know anything about public health, so the first thing I did was to subscribe, and this was snail mail, to all of the public health related journals, including the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report out of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, the MMWR. And it was there in June of '81 that I read that first 2 paragraphs describing this mysterious ailment that was attacking young homosexual men in Los Angeles and New York and San Francisco. And they were getting a disease called Kaposi's sarcoma and another one called pneumocystis pneumonia. Kaposi's sarcoma had been identified in the 1850s. It presented among men, mostly of Mediterranean and Jewish descent. It would present as small slightly raised purple spots on the feet and ankles, but the men who had it would die of old age. It didn't progress, it was not considered to be a life-threatening condition. But among these young men, these young gay men of many different ethnicities, it was spreading rapidly across their body, the surface of the body, and attacking internal organs, the brain, pancreas, the lungs, and it was killing them. And then the other one was pneumocystis pneumonia, which had been seen primarily among IV drug-using populations on the East Coast, but also in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is our country's transplant center. There have been a number of cases documented of people whose immune systems had been deliberately suppressed with medication so that they could have a transplant and not reject the organ. So I clipped that out and I put it on the bulletin board, and I thought, this is bad. There's something here that was really profoundly troubling. That was June of 1981. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or home caring for someone who was dying. It went through my neighborhood like an avalanche, and it took just about everybody I loved. And when November came around, towards the end of November every year, I was reenacting the Candlelight March because I was trying to keep people, I wanted people to remember Harvey, and he was going away. His memory was disappearing, and fewer people were coming each year to the marches. And that year, in 1985, I'm walking up and down Castro Street with my staple gun, putting up posters and talking to people in the bars and saying, hey, we're going to remember Harvey Milk and George Moscone. And then I looked at the headline of the newspaper in the rack on the corner, and it said 1,000 dead. 1,000 people had died in San Francisco already. And how many of you have been to San Francisco? You know, you visualize the corner of Castro and Market. That's where I saw that headline. And I remember standing at that intersection and looking around and realizing of these first 1,000 to die, almost every one of them had lived and died within a few blocks of where I was standing, 6 blocks, 8 blocks. And you know, you've been there, and I could walk you down the street now, and it looks it's unchanged. The beautiful Victorians, and you smell coffee and food, and hear music and laughter, and there's absolutely no indication that you're at the epicenter of this appalling tragedy that was spreading, even as we were beginning to comprehend what had happened. And I became so enraged by this. We had a president at the time. His name was Reagan. He has since been elevated to sainthood in some quarters. You know, he didn't say the word AIDS in public until more Americans had died of it than died in the entire Vietnam War. And when they did speak of it, they said, let them die. They had cute little bumper stickers at the Republican convention that said, AIDS, it's killing all the right people. Who were those people? They were homosexuals. They were dark-skinned Haitian immigrants. They were IV drug users. They were sex workers. They were black people. They were gay people, and they were black people. And I got angrier and angrier, and I also got obsessed with this idea that there was no evidence of what was happening because it was so stigmatized. And families were afraid to reveal, not just in Arkansas, but all across the country, families were afraid to reveal the nature of their sons' and daughters' illnesses. And this all got wrapped up in my head, and I remember saying to my friend Joseph, who has since, he's long gone now, but he was helping me put up the posters, I said, you know, if we could tear down these Victorians, if we could do away with all this cute architecture, these clubs, if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would see, and they would understand, and if they were human beings, they would be compelled to respond. But there was no such response. And so a few nights later, as people began to gather for the annual candlelight tribute, I had Harvey's old bullhorn, and I had stacks of poster board that my friend Paul brought. I think he stole them. And with magic markers, and I talked to the crowd and I said, we're remembering Harvey Milk and George Moscone tonight, but we were also remembering our friends and our lovers and our neighbors who have died. And at first people were reluctant to write their names, but then they did. And we had hundreds of names on these placards, and we took them with our candles to City Hall and left our candles at City Hall, and then we went to the old Federal Building in San Francisco, and we'd hidden extension ladders in the shrubbery outside. and this nun with the beard on a bicycle distracted the police over here, and we put the ladders up and climbed up with big rolls of tape on our wrists, and we just covered the whole front gray stone facade of the federal building with these names. And it was a cold night, typical late fall San Francisco drizzle, fog. There was no music, no speeches, no chanting, just thousands and thousands of people standing in the rain and reading the names on the wall and whispering to each other, I went to school with him. We're from the same hometown. I didn't know he died. Nobody told me. I wish I could have done something to help. And I'm wandering through the crowd, and I could just feel that deep yearning need to find a way to grieve together and also to reach out and warn the world of what was coming. I flunked biology, but I'm not stupid. There's no such thing as a gay virus. And I got to the edge of the crowd, and I looked over the crowd at that patchwork of names on the wall, and I thought, oh, it looks like some kind of crazy quilt. What do you think of when you say the word quilt? I think of my grandma, my great-grandma back in Bee Ridge, Indiana, and the quilts they made out of my great-grandpa's pajamas. It's on my bed at home right now. And it was such a warm, comforting, middle-class, middle American, traditional family values sort of symbol. I believe in traditional family values. I want them to apply to me, and my family, and yours. And that was the idea. And I closed my eyes and I opened them, and I could see the National Mall in Washington, D.C. just covered from the Capitol to the Washington Monument with fabric. And that was the idea. Which everybody promptly told me was the stupidest idea they'd ever heard of in their life. You know that chorus, don't you? You stand up with an idea and they're going to shoot you down. And so for a whole year, I became the most boring person in San Francisco. I think we should start this quote. Oh, girl, that's so morbid. It's so expensive. It sounds really complicated. I don't know, does anybody sew anymore? I don't think so. And then finally I just got sick of it, and my best friend died. His name was Marvin Feldman. We met when we both sold Time Life books over the telephone. Most god-awful job you can imagine. Calling people up, cold, hi, buy my book, and which is what I'm doing now. Buy my book, it's in the front. I'll sign it. So to get through the crushing boredom of these 6-hour shifts of calling bored housewives in suburbia and trying to sell them these photography books, which were kind of nice actually, I would come up with different nom de phone. So I would call people up and, hello, Mrs. Smith? Hi, this is Willie Loman calling for Time Life Books in San Francisco. Okay, those of you who didn't just at least chuckle a little bit need to read Arthur Miller's great play, Death of a Salesman. Nobody ever got it, don't feel bad. And then one day, I had long hair, and I would stand up on my chair and just like shriek into the phone, buy my fucking book. And then I did this Willie Loman routine, and I heard somebody burst out laughing, and I turned around, and there was a new boy working at Time Life. And he was so fine, oh my God. This big mop of curly hair, these enormous blue-gray eyes, and these cheekbones, and these neck muscles. Oh, God. So I asked him out. We had our first date that night. We went to the very romantic little spot on Folsom Street called the Stud. And we played pool, and we danced, and we made out by the cigarette machine. And then he walked me home, and we got to my door, and I said, well, you're going to come in and spend the night, right? And he looked at me with those big, beautiful eyes, and he said, you know, I think we're going to be friends. Don't you hate it when that happens? Just what I need, another friend, great. But he was that friend, and you know, I sincerely hope all of you live to be 120 years old, and at the end of your lives, if you look back at your lives and you had a friend like I had with Marvin, you would know how blessed you were, because he was always there for me, and I was always there for him, and we planned that we would be friends for the rest of our lives. We traveled all over the world together. He ended up in New York, so whenever a show opened, I was there. He didn't like politics, but when I was on stage, he was there. I didn't know much about theater, but I would travel anywhere to see him. And then I had to go to Providence, Rhode Island to say goodbye to him. And when I got back from Providence, my heart was just filled with hatred. not just grief, hatred for the straight world that was allowing this to happen. I went on television, I went public about my own status on 60 Minutes and was attacked by Nazi skinheads and stabbed and beaten. I felt a lot of hate and a lot of despair and a lot of fear. And I just felt that I had to do something, and I just started making those damn quilts. And when we had 40 of them, a few of my friends agreed to help, and they were kind of grudging, but as we began to create them, we noticed what it was like to create the quilt panels and share the stories about the person while we were doing it. I thought, this is therapy. This could help people that are grieving. And then when we got ready to show it, we realized this was a great tool for the media. Let's go beyond the statistics. Look how much love was in this person's life. This person was an uncle, was a son, maybe a father, maybe a soldier, maybe a teacher, maybe a priest. And we began to reveal the humanity that were behind the statistics. And as we did that, I began to meet more and more people who helped me replace that hatred and despair and fear with love and hope and courage. And I think that was probably the greatest impact of the quilt. And it helped America come to know her gay children at the time of our greatest suffering. And it changed the hearts and minds of millions of people in my country and in yours and all across the world. So it's just another example. We began the evening with her example of an ordinary person finding a situation in the hospital room and thinking, I have to do something about this. Those of us who created the quilt were completely unprepared for anything like that. But we did it. I didn't get sick for a few more years. And then I got sick and I thought, well, now it is over. And I begin my book by saying that the movement saved my life. And it's really true. I would not be here today if it was not for the movement. The movement saved my life when I was a 15-year-old boy getting ready to kill myself. And it saved my life in my 30s when I began to die of AIDS. I was down to 120 pounds. I was losing my vision. I had horrible fungal infections throughout my esophagus and mouth and throat. I couldn't walk by myself. And then ACT UP stormed the NIH and the FDA and got the drugs released before they were approved and saved my life and the life of hundreds of thousands of others. So when people say, oh, I don't want to talk about politics or I'm not interested in activism, I want to slap them really hard. The choices that we make matter. I got into the first clinical trial for what we now call the cocktail, which is a slander against vodka tonics, by the way. And it took me a while, but I got stronger and healthier with every year that passed. About 15 years ago, I started working with the labor movement because I got a little sick of the LGBTQIA, whatever you call it up here, introspection, infighting, bullshit. I don't, and again, I'm going to care about this. You tell me what your pronoun is, and I will not disrespect that. And I am for all of us and all of our different permutations and subsets, but my God, how many different subsets do we have to divide ourselves into before we realize we're the same people? And right now, the world faces fascism. I'm working for a union in the United States and your country called Unite Here. It's the Hospitality Workers Union. I think we're Local 75 in Toronto. I can't remember the number in Vancouver. We're a union that's growing in the private sector. And we are gay and straight and young and old and black and brown and white, immigrant and native born, documented and undocumented. We're growing. We're winning huge victories. The state of Nevada went blue because of my union registering Latino voters. We just elected the first state legislature that is majority female in the history of the United States. We sent the first Latina to the United States Senate. Now, people want to talk about their vocabulary and their initials and how many stripes they want to add to the flag. We, through collective bargaining, negotiate contracts in Mississippi and Georgia and Texas and Florida that protect transgender workers from discrimination and abuse on the job and pays for their transition costs through the health plan. So that's what I'm looking for right now, is people with vision and a willingness to do the hard work and to dispense with the yakety-yak-yak and the circular firing squad. And I think in my country it's as bad, it's maybe worse than yours, but it's bad up here too, because I read your media. And we got to get our act together because, you know, you're absolutely right. We're going backwards. Not just in my country, we're going backwards in Brazil, we're going backwards in the UK, the European Union is under assault. We see a rise of white supremacy, of nationalism, of outright fascism, and everything that you think you've managed to secure for yourselves here, and we have in our country, all of this is up for grabs now. We can't take any of this for granted. Now, I've worked very hard, but I've loved every minute of it. I don't need anybody to thank me for what I've done. People say, oh, you know, thank you for your sacrifice. I've made no sacrifice. I do this work because I love it. It is exciting to me, and it puts me in touch with the most amazing people. And I've been privileged to, in my life, march and meet with some of the most extraordinary leaders our generations have seen. And we often repeat that phrase that the arc is long but bends towards justice. Not necessarily. So I would just appeal to you before we stop, and I hope you have questions and comments, to think about what it is that you bring to the struggle. What is your responsibility? What is your gift? Every one of you has something unique and beautiful and wonderful that you can bring to this movement. I don't care how old you are or how young you are, what kind of shape you're in physically, whatever your circumstances. Every one of you has something you can bring to this. Find what that is and find something that brings you joy, because what we're up against is not going to be solved quickly. Even if we defeat Trump, and I pray to God we do, even if we do, the genie has been let loose. So those things that matter most are never won in a day or a week or a year. This is an ongoing struggle. Find your part in it. Find a way of contributing that brings you joy, because you deserve to be happy. In the face of all of this, maybe the most important thing we can do is to have joy and love and solidarity in our lives, and let that be our example. So that's where I'm at today as I approach my 65th year on the planet. And healthy, I'm happy, I'm in love, and it's not over. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Both of these, this has been a gift to us here in the city of Calgary, to come together in community and hear stories, and not just be at home watching Netflix documentaries, but actually being together and sharing in this. So I invite the audience to ask questions. We've got some time, 15, 20 minutes for questions. I have one right off the top. Also, we don't have a microphone in the audience, so you're going to have to kind of stand up maybe and shout your question. You both talked about the emotional burden of your respective work. How do you get through those tough times when you have a community that is trying to run you out of town, when you're at a low point and afraid? How do you move through that?
Well, you just do it. You just do it. And it doesn't matter. It does. Well, it did. because I wanted to have a family and another husband. I had one, but, it didn't count. But I really thought that, and I used to have these women that all gather up and go, she wants to sleep with your husband. I think she slept with his husband. No, they were asking me how to keep their wives safe because they had gone out to a convention and had unprotected sex. So no, I don't want your husband, but I'm trying to help him keep you alive, bitch. But you just do what you have to do, and you'll know what you have to do. Just keep your eyes open and walk through doors. Don't let a door keep you out. And don't let anyone say, you can't go there, you can't do anything, because you might just save a life. And you get up every morning and you just do it.
Yes, I agree. For me, there are times when I just, there's a popular phrase now, it's, self-care. For me, I will just take a day off and I'll go walk on the beach by myself in the ocean. But I think more practically, it's whiskey. I go out and I have a couple drinks at my local bar where I've been hanging out since the early 1970s. And it's a bar that's always been welcoming to all generations and body types and genders and colors. And it's been through so many different owners and different names, but it's kind of my home. I'm a bar queen. And when I go there, I just really feel my community, my family, in a way that may sound silly to you, but that's just been like a touchstone for me. If I need to get people to turn out for a march or a rally, I go to the mix and I recruit my brothers and my sisters and we go and do that. And I can go there and have a couple whiskeys and bitch and moan and say, and then go home and wake up the next morning with a hangover and get back to work. Just do it.
Okay, question right here. Someone had a question? It's a little bit hard to see because of these lights. Right over here.
What was your opinion of the film Milk? And I understand you had a lot to do with Dustin Lance Black making the film.
The story of Milk is pretty interesting. My friend Gilbert Baker, who passed away recently, the creator of the Rainbow Flag, was visiting me in I took a brief period of time in Palm Springs, and there was this young man named Damon Intrabartolo who'd been writing to me, sending me emails. I don't know how he tracked me down, and ultimately he sent me an actual written letter, and he said he wanted to interview me for a project he was doing. He was kind of mysterious, but it turned out he was writing a rock opera, a musical that was based on my friendship with Harvey. And I looked him up, and he had a show, a very successful off-Broadway musical called Bear, a Catholic gay school kid coming of age story. So I met him, and Gilbert was there, and we really liked him. And I had all these boxes of photographs in the garage that I hadn't looked at in 30 years, and I dumped them out in the living room, and he started writing a musical. And then he got slowed. And he said that he needed to bring somebody to write the book so he could focus on the music and the lyrics. And he had done a little documentary with Dustin Lance Black about 4 boys going to Burning Man together. And so he brought Lance over, and he was writing for, I don't know if it showed up here, it was on Showtime, Big Love. Did anybody see that? Yeah. So he was one of the writers because he came from a Mormon background. And I think was the only writer on Big Love that came from a Mormon background. So we all started working together, and then Damon, the musician, the composer, he's gone now, so I'll just say he got strung out on meth, but we didn't realize what was going on. But finally the whole thing fell apart, and Lance and I were driving back to LA, and he's like, well, shit, we've got all this material. And he said, I've always wanted to write a screenplay. And I said, well, I know a director, but I didn't tell him who. But Gus Van Sant and I had been roommates 20 years prior when Gus had wanted to tell the Harvey Milk story and actually was attached briefly to an attempt to base it on Randy Schultz's book, The Mayor of Castro Street. But that didn't go anywhere, partly because they brought Oliver Stone in to do it. Hey, so Lance and I kept going back up to San Francisco, and he was so charming that all of the people who were still alive who'd worked with Harvey agreed to talk to him, and Michael Wong actually shared the diaries that he'd kept. So Lance put together this extraordinary amount of material and wrote the screenplay. And I remember vividly reading it. He had a little house in the Hollywood Hills, and he said, okay, sit down. And I sat down at his kitchen table, and by this time I'd probably read, I don't know, probably 30 treatments or outlines and at least a dozen full-on scripts that all sucked, including one that Gus Van Sant had written. We still joke about how awful it was. And then I read this one, the first draft, and I could just hear Harvey's voice in it. I just thought it was really a great first draft, and I called up Gus, and he said, sure, bring him on over, and we went up, and he read it and said, okay, I'll do it. And then we reached out to Bruce Cohen and Dan Jinks, who had just come off doing American Beauty. They were the producers of American Beauty. And they took it to Sean, and he said he would do it. And I was a historical consultant for the film, and I got to pick who played me, which was really sweet. I will say I'm taller. But Emil, I think, did a great job. And the one performance in there that I think should have received more attention was Josh Brolin as Dan White. Oh my God, it was uncanny. Really, really. I couldn't sit next to him at lunch when he was in character. It was just like, oh sure, Adolf, let's have a bagel.
Thank you, Neil. Do you have another question? There's one over here.
I have a question for Ruth. You mentioned staying where you were because it's where you knew you would get help. How did you conscript help where you saw need?
Well, I was, there were a group of Marines that came back from World War II, and they had decided Hot Spring was very corrupt, and the mayor was keeping everybody beaten down, and the gangsters would, pay him. They'd have their paper bag full of money on his desk every Monday morning, and it was just awful. And even things in the state weren't going right, and they decided that they were going to do something about it. They were overseas in the Pacific, probably laying out under the stars one night, and decided that they were coming home and they were going to take over, and they did, and they were good Democrats too. But I knew who everybody was in town, and I knew that the dry cleaners, that, he'd been a sniper in Germany and came back, and everybody came back to their regular old selves and their regular jobs, and nobody would ever think. And then Mr. Cup at the bank, he's gone, so I can say his name, but God love him. He had a family, and it was like the second or third generation of the bank, and I knew that I could go to him too. I had a young man who, his family were bank customers of his, and I went to him and I said, Mr. Cup, one of your banking family, they have a son, and this is the situation. He needs to fly home air ambulance. He picked up the phone, he put it down, he said, the plane's waiting. So I knew who to, we all went to the same church, and I didn't go to that church because of the doctors and lawyers and all of that, but that's where God was for me. And every Sunday he was there, and some Sundays I would sit and cry through the entire sermon, And, you know, my daughter was never invited to one single birthday party in her entire life. She's 38 now. And I just knew that they were there. And my personal doctor was the doctor in town who would take AIDS patients. But I had to, you know, first I had to bring their blood in through the back door and don't tell anybody and this, that, and the other. And luckily, Tim was a former IV drug user, and he loved the feel of the needle, so he taught me how to start IVs and how to draw blood. And he enjoyed it. He said, "No, I really like it when you stick me with a needle." I'm like, "Well, good, because you're going to get stuck with a lot of them." And he would say,
One of those leather guys.
"That's it." And he would say, "Not like a helicopter, going like you're landing an airplane." I know. And I would take the blood in, and, you know, it was all very covert and everything. And then my pharmacist, I would take them to the, even to fill out their death certificates. I would bring a pizza, and we would sit and just laugh and have the best time. And I would ask who his mother was. He never knew I was filling out his death certificate because no one would know who anybody was when he died. No one knew who his mother was or his dad or where they were from. And so we would have pizza and fill out that death certificate and have the best time and hug, and he would feel just like $1 million, and I'd cry all the way home. But there were people in the community, and everybody knows people in the community, and they may not be the mayor or this or that, but you'll find them, and they will help you do magical things.
Plus, they had to keep you away from their husbands.
There's a question in the third row right here.
When you started the NAME project, it was so that people would remember we were here. We've moved on in our HIV response to agencies that more or less are run by social workers, where their credo is never say anything, never reveal a name because of disclosure. For our last World AIDS Day event, I suggested a number of ways where we could honor the people who we've passed, and every single one was met with, "No, we can't do that because it would reveal people's status." How would you respond to that kind of situation?
They were afraid to reveal the status of people who had passed. Well, I don't think that makes any sense. But I think there's a bigger issue behind this question, I think, in my mind. I've had young people challenge me and tell me in my neighborhood, there's a group of very attractive young tech workers at my bar, the bar I mentioned. This bar I've been hanging out in for, since before I was legal. And they were eavesdropping on a bunch of old farts, talking about how the neighborhood was changing. And one of us had said, "How many of us died here?" And one guy said, "I think it was 15,000. No, it was 20,000. And somebody else who worked at the health department said, "Actually, it's probably, for this neighborhood, over the 10 years before treatment, was probably 25,000. And these young gay men, presumably educated, said we were exaggerating. They didn't know. They were living in this neighborhood where 25,000 of their brothers had died. And now we see the infection rates are going back up. I think the PrEP is extremely useful, but we're seeing that it's not everybody has access to it. And by the way, worldwide 700,000 people died of HIV last year. It's not over. But I get very concerned that the younger generation doesn't know. And then when you add to that the reality that half of our generation didn't survive, so those stories are gone, and it troubles me a lot because I want our young people to be strong, because I think that they're about to face absolute terror, and I don't think they're prepared. And if they knew more about what we did, it's not about them saying, "Oh God, you guys were so fierce." It's about them thinking, "Oh, maybe that could help us survive what's coming."
I just wanted Ruth to know that many years ago, in 1990, I was the executive director of the Vancouver Food Bank. And a lady came to me in Easter, and she was doing Sunday dinners. And every week I would save whatever hands, we were serving over 6,000 people a week at the food bank. And it was all the straight indigenous, all the community. But she would come to me and say, can you save the hams and the turkeys? I read about this woman, and she's helping people, and as a straight woman, I'd like to see what I can do. So she started a thing called Easter's Dinners. They were every Sunday for a group of people who were ostracized from their families and whatever, and she would do a Sunday dinner for them. And after a while, we said, why can't we make this better? And they went from Easter dinners to what they call Vancouver Meal Society, which is like Meals on Wheels for people living with HIV and other diseases. And then it became Loving Spoonful, and it's still thriving today. So that's been there a long time. And when you speak about recognizing, I was one of the founders of the Vancouver AIDS Memorial. And our first memorial was approved for Stanley Park. And then one of the TV stations put out a report and said, do you think it's appropriate for people who have died of AIDS to be memorialized in Stanley Park? And 94% of the respondents in the Lower Mainland said no. So the Parks Board canceled our authorization and we started from scratch. Today that is sitting on Sunset Beach with the names of people who have passed HIV. And it was one of those things that we looked at your work, Cleve, and said, if people can start with a small idea and make it grow, then we can make this work. And that is your hope, your inspirations were inspirations for the work that myself and other members of our community have been able to accomplish.
Thank you. And, you know, I think this also relates to what he was commenting about, that I think many of us feel that that sort of grassroots is so overused, but that kind of organic grassroots, ordinary folks. I mean, your counterpart, one of your counterparts in San Francisco was a woman named Ruth Brinker, who learned that her neighbor had starved to death because he was too weak to get food, and all of his friends had died. So she started cooking. That turned into the Open Hand is our meal delivery program in San Francisco. Same thing with people who were kicked out of their homes. And I think that for many of us, it's a little painful to see it all become corporatized. In San Francisco, the Shanti Project, which has been providing loving support and practical care and housing and everything, next month is having a big gala dinner. Their board of directors is all cisgendered, straight people, not HIV, not one of them is HIV positive. And they're giving a Lifetime Achievement Award to a Republican socialite who just hosted a party for Trump's re-election. You know, so it's
And I used to dumpster dive to my daughter's she was just horrified. But I would go around, and I knew which dumpsters had the best food and the most of it. But I also there was someone at the Piggly Wiggly on Park Avenue. That's where I found my dog. Anyway, he was waiting to go in, and they said, we're calling the pound. His owner hasn't been here. We don't know what happened. And I said, well, are you going with me? And he got in my car, and he didn't leave he was the best dog and partner I ever had. But anyway, I digress. His name was Sam. But anyway, and I would and there was a gentleman that I thought was gay, and he worked at that store, and he would leave the food on the outside of the dumpster, so I didn't have to climb in the dumpster. And I would take it home and clean it, and then I love to cook, and I think I'm a good cook, but I haven't had any complaints. And I would make the most wonderful soups and stews and whatever I could, and I would take it to each. I would get up in the morning, take my daughter to school, and I'd just start on my route. And so, it took dumpster diving. But you have to do everything within your power to get this done.
Well, I got a note from one of the organizers that we have to wrap up here, but I wanted to thank Ruth and Cleve so much for honoring us with your presence tonight. And let's one more round of applause, please. And thank you to Keon. It was his imagination that brought this all together. So Cleve is here to sign books for a little while, and then afterwards you're all invited to Twisted Element to carry this conversation on. So thank you very much for coming out tonight, and we'll see you soon.